Welcome, everyone. This is the follow-up discussion to class number 5 in our LaRouche Pack class series on the new paradigm. You can see I'm joined in the studio by Mike Billington, who taught the class last week on the ecumenical unity of East and West. Now, hopefully everyone had a chance to watch that class, where Mike spent some time taking us through some of the history, a very important history of thought and ideas about the nature of man and man's mind within Chinese culture, both from the standpoint of thinkers like Confucius and Mencius, and also as opposed to the legalists. And what you took us through, I think, is really important for having access to a better insight into not only what we see coming from China today with the policies that they're pursuing, but also the potential that we have to come together to form a new paradigm based on what Helga LaRouche has called for in terms of a new renaissance, bringing the best of one's culture to the table. Now, tonight we are joined by a live audience in Seattle, Washington, and we're also joined by our online audience. And tonight is going to be a chance for further discussion where Mike will have the opportunity to address questions that came in last week that we weren't able to get to, questions that have come in the intervening week, and also address some of the homework assignments that he gave you and that some of you answered. And this is also a chance for you to ask questions of Mike and raise your thoughts and objections and discussion and questions. Now, as always, tonight's discussion is not being broadcast publicly, so we hope that'll make you a little more comfortable to speak freely. So I'll turn it over to Mike in just a second, but we will be taking not only the questions that came in since last week, but we'll also be taking questions live from our Seattle audience and from you watching online. And if you're watching online, you can either email your questions to classes@larouchepack.com, or, and we would really like this, you can call into our live conference system, and you can find the instructions for doing that on the class page and ask your question directly. The instructions for doing that are all right there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Okay, so my plan here is I want to say a few words about Confucianism in the modern era, a couple of points, take maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll address some of the remarks that people sent in, which I think were very thoughtful. And then we'll turn to questions, the ones that any new ones that come in. I encourage you to call in and ask your question or send in questions, but I have about 8 or 10 questions that were left over from last week too, so we can do that. So there's 3 events I think are worth thinking about, just so people have a sense of how crucial Confucianism and its relationship to Western Christian thought, how important they are throughout Chinese history, and especially at crucial turning points. And I'm going to address 3 of those turning points. The first is the so-called rights controversy. This took place. The first Jesuit missionary who came into China, Matteo Ricci, in the end of the 16th century. He first started working with the Buddhists. He saw them in their saffron robes, and he assumed that these were the religious of the community. But he soon learned that the government leaders, the scholars, and as we discussed last week, the scholars are the ones who become government leaders. You prove yourself through being able to be a person who understands Confucian traditions and who knows how to apply them to society. So he then very rapidly turned to work. He kept talking to Buddhists and Taoists and so forth, but he very much objected to what is sometimes known in China as the 3 religions. And this is something that still existed in the modern era, which is that somehow you can be a Confucian and a Taoist and a Buddhist, and each of them has something to contribute to your religious beliefs, which I strongly opposed in some of my writings and got in some trouble with that with the head of the Beijing Library in at one point. And I'm sure he got in trouble too, but he fought for that idea that the Confucian ethic was not. He said it was not necessarily a religious phenomena. But he said that if they could reject this three religions idea and focus on the Confucian beliefs that were compatible, very compatible with Christianity, and if they would give up a few of the things that were acceptable, like polygamy, and so forth, that Chinese could easily become Christians and Confucians. And that was, in fact, the way he organized. And he and his followers ended up becoming major advisors to the emperors. They took control over the astronomical societies, which were very, very important. Astronomy was extremely important to the Chinese, both scientifically and because they considered sort of astrological issues about the meaning of certain events. And there was a competition between the Jesuits and the Muslims who had come before had also, based on their science, which was very advanced science, had become pretty much the heads of the astronomical societies in Beijing. So they actually had a contest who could predict an eclipse more accurately, and the Christians won. But in any case, their argument was that, and they recruited leading Chinese scholars and government officials to become Christians. Leibniz had a similar view. Leibniz argued in his writings that I referenced last week, he argued that Confucianism is not actually a religion the way the Christians view religion. I don't think it's worth discussing whether it is or isn't a religion per se, but he made the point that that it's more of a natural theology, is what Leibniz called it, in the sense that they praise Confucius, but they don't pray to him. They don't consider him to be transcendent. And they don't ask anything of Confucius as well. But he said it's a religion in the sense, or it's a belief that excites men to perform actions which render them worthy of the recognition of posterity. So in any case, this went on from the early 1600s until the end of the 1600s. The emperor at that time was Kangxi, one of the great emperors of the Qing era. And he, in 1692, issued an edict which gave the Christians, not just Jesuits, there were Franciscans and Dominicans and others, gave them full rights to go out and proselytize across China. I mean, that's how close they became in terms of their collaborative relationship around philosophical ideas and scientific ideas. But there was fierce opposition coming from Venice, from factions of the Franciscans and Dominicans and some of the Jesuits as well, the Jesuits who had been in Japan, whose argument in Japan was that Japanese must renounce all of their pagan beliefs in order to become Christian. And in coming into China, they basically, without thinking, I would strongly argue, said that all of the beliefs of the Chinese before we arrived with the truth must be renounced, or else they can't be Christians. So this became a very huge fight. The Venetian crowd within the Catholic Church back in Italy argued strenuously that the Jesuits were blasphemous in allowing Christians or Confucians rather, to continue honoring their ancestors. The way they did it was that they had tablets, sort of like our gravestones, but they had tablets representing their ancestors, and they would give obedience or obeisance to that, which was then denounced as praying to a symbol or being a pagan, in the sense that they were praying to something that was not God. This kind of argument, completely oblivious to the realities of what was going on in China historically and still at that time. But they succeeded in getting a Pope, Clement the 11th, in 1704, to issue a bull declaring that in order to be a Christian, you had to absolutely renounce Confucianism. When Kangxi read this bull, he said, "I can only conclude that Westerners are small-minded, the same as Buddhists and Taoists, heresies and superstitions. I have never seen such nonsense," he said. And then he explained that this was an attack on the government, because to say you could not be a Confucian would be to say you cannot be a member of the government of China, because through this merit system based on Confucian scholarship, that's how you earned being a leader. And this was basically saying that anybody who became a Christian could not be in the government and had to actually oppose the government. So Kangxi was left with no choice, despite his practically being a Christian himself, as to expel the Christians altogether from China. So this was really a fight in Europe. It was a fight between the Leibnizian Cusa faction, you might say, versus the imperial faction, which unfortunately had a very domineering position within the church, especially in the Venetian crowd. So that's the era. Now, what happened? You can look at history, you can see what happened. The Chinese connection to Europe was broken. The Chinese continued to be a relatively prosperous country, but they lost the connection to the tremendous scientific developments that were taking in Europe in the Renaissance, and tended to not degenerate so much, but stagnate. And then 100 years later, the British came in with their gunboats and their opium and basically took over and destroyed the country. So the second point, the second time, is in fact during the Opium War, where again Confucianism was crucial to this. The British were selling their opium out of Hong Kong and Canton, which is now Guangzhou, and the emperor had written to Queen Victoria saying, "For God's sake, stop this! Could you imagine us coming to your country and peddling opium to your people? Stop it." But of course they didn't. So the emperor sent a guy named Lin Zishu, who was one of the top government officials and scholars in Beijing, down to Canton, Guangzhou. And this was a Confucian issue, because the compradors, the Chinese opium dealers, the actually government officials in Canton who were working with the British to peddle the opium and making money, a lot of money, and also becoming opium addicts themselves, were part of a school of Confucianism called Han Learning, which was very much like what we've described as the Aristotelian faction, that basically allowed people to act in any way they wanted. I compare them to the Soros open society type people who are liberals, but they were very, very pragmatic. And of course, the compradors were becoming rich on the opium trade, just like the British were. So they were pragmatically becoming drug sellers. So when Lin went down there, he moved into the home of the leading actual Confucian scholar, and basically set about arresting the people from the Han Learning School who were the government officials there. And then the famous story is that he basically pulled together all of the chests of opium, 20,000 of them altogether, and had a huge bonfire where the opium was burned. The British responded by saying, "This is anti-free trade. You are destroying free trade. This is immoral for you to destroy free trade. You don't understand freedom." And therefore, they sent in the gunboats, destroyed Canton, went to war across the country. And I won't go through the details of that. I think you probably know about it. So that was obviously a huge turning point. That was the destruction of China. From that point on, the next 150 years were pure hell in China. And then lastly, I'll mention in the Cultural Revolution. Many people know something about the Cultural Revolution that was unleashed in around 1966 and went until approximately 1976, a total nightmare in China. People look at it in a certain sense the same way Germans look at the Nazi era. It was a turning inwards, a self-destruction, anti any foreign influence, any foreign music, any classical music, and also against any Chinese classical culture, to the point where towards the end in 1973, they launched what was called the Criticize Confucius campaign. It became later known as the Criticize Lin and Criticize Confucius, meaning Lin Biao, who they accuse of having tried to kill Mao. But mainly it was anti-Confucian. It was anti-Chinese classical culture, explicitly. And people who had statues or sayings of Confucius were attacked. Families were encouraged to tear down their families' plaques or images of Confucius and so forth. And this then morphed into an attack on Zhou Enlai. And I won't try to give a history of this, but many of you know that Zhou Enlai was who was the closest person to Mao. Mao pretty much had two factions going all the time, and he was trying to balance them at all times. The faction of his wife, Jiang Qing, who was the leader of the so-called Gang of Four, are the people who actually ran the Cultural Revolution. And they eventually turned against Zhou Enlai, who was trying to maintain contacts with the foreign nations. He was one of the great men in China, and it was within the Maoist group. And he's the one who eventually opened up China with the meetings with Kissinger and all that kind of stuff. But towards the end of this, it turned into an anti-Zhou Enlai campaign, and they were close to bringing him down. And they were also close to bringing down the entire science community in China. The Red Guards were marching on the science communities, especially those that were involved in nuclear technology, and Zhou Enlai defended them. So this, again, became very much a Confucian issue. When the Cultural Revolution ended, and when Mao died and Zhou Enlai had died, and basically the Huo Fang, who took over, arrested the Gang of Four, this anti-Confucius campaign was stopped at that point. But this was the core of the Cultural Revolution, was the attack on China's own classical culture and Confucianism. So I want to go from there into answering one of the questions that came in from Kevin in Vancouver. And then I'll say a few other things about the so-called homework. But Kevin asked, why is it that today there are still images of Mao all over China? Isn't that strange? Wasn't Mao, he didn't go on and explain it, but the implication being that we have this image of Mao as some sort of a tyrant, somebody who almost destroyed China, and that he was the core of the Cultural Revolution, for instance. Well, Mao's a very complex figure. And he is still, in fact, revered in China by most Chinese. And they all say Mao made horrible mistakes, and they acknowledge the horrible mistakes. But when you talk about the Cultural Revolution in China, they always go after the Gang of Four, which was his wife and three other people who became really the implementers. They're the ones who started the cult of Mao. They had the Little Red Book. They pursued this idea of the Red Guards going after leadership, after authoritarian people, and so forth. And Mao is revered both because he led the revolution, which by and large did make China independent completely from Western forces, too much to a certain extent, but also because he was a great poet and a great historian. And his writings and his poetry are still, in fact, loved by the Chinese people. So when you see his picture in Tiananmen Square, along with Marx and so forth, these still have meaning. This is not just tradition. There's an aspect of this with which I encourage you to study, actually, if you get the chance. And then before we go to hopefully some questions that'll come in, I'll say a few words about the things that people sent in response to the questions that I had posed. The first one was a quote from Zhu Xi where Zhu Xi says, spreading charity is not Ren. So I said, what do you think of this and how does this compare to Christianity? Well, it was sort of a trick question because it's the word charity. And I have to admit, I don't know what the Chinese word is that was translated into charity in this phrase. But I'm sure, and from what people wrote in, most people did think about that famous passage from the Bible from 1 Corinthians 13, which says, now abideth faith, hope, and charity, meaning agape, faith, hope, and agape, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. Well, I think, and Richard Burton also sent in saying, this is a bad translation. It's the King James version of the Bible, which used the word charity here for agape. And maybe at that time it meant something different, but as we know, today charity tends to be helping the poor, alms to the poor, giving contributions to charitable institutions, and so on. And if you look back at 1 Corinthians 13, you'll remember that one of the phrases in there is, "And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, but have not charity, it profiteth me nothing." Well, they mean agape, because bestowing all your goods to the poor is charity. So that was a little confusing to some people, but I think most people recognized that that the idea of ren, or of agape, is of a much higher order than charity. And I think several people had interesting things to say about that. Sydney in Germany sent in saying that if you giving bread is good, but teaching somebody to make bread is better, and pointed out that you cannot separate love or agape from wisdom. So just being good in the sense of a charitable giving or something is not necessarily wisdom. A similar thing was sent in by Karen in Florida, who said that you give him, this is a common saying in the West, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him to fish, and he'll feed himself for a lifetime. A same idea, that there's something far more important than charity, which is to have the wisdom to know how to address how you transform a person or a society. What's interesting with what Karen said is that she thought this was a passage from the Bible, and she looked it up, and it turned out to be a Chinese proverb, which is very appropriate for our purposes here. Then on this, Pavel noted that our time, especially, and history really shows the error of thinking that a person is agapic because he's charitable to the poor. And I think that's very clear. We have people like the Rockefellers and George Soros, for instance, who are philanthropists, who are full of charity for their favorite charities, but are doing perhaps more evil than other people in history to undermine the society. I think Jeff Stahl put it most clearly when he said, spreading charity without agape allows you to believe you're doing everything possible to address a problem without making a commitment to address the cause of the problem. And that's exactly the point, is that you have to be looking at what's the cause. And this is, of course, what Mencius referred to over and over again in saying that if there's want in the kingdom, you lose the mandate of heaven. You can't just hand things out. You have to change your society to address the cause, that it's the king's fault. It's the form of government that's responsible for the death of the people through starvation and crime and chaos and so forth. On the second question, well, I don't have to say much about that. That was the Bertrand Russell who said he praises the Chinese for putting ethical sentiments more important than science, and that this is their only problem. But I think everybody saw that the question is not which is more important, but that one cannot go without the other. And people had different ways of saying that, but it's obviously the point that science is, in fact, the idea that there's no morality or ethical qualities in science is an absurdity. Which is the cause of the breakdown of science, in fact, for the same reasons that we've been discussing. So I won't go through those, but I will mention that Anne in Denmark brought up a second issue on this, which I think is worth addressing. She said that how do we lift ourselves to the level of agape? How do we deal with raising our emotions to the level of reason and thus become agapic in our activities? And how do you deal with evil? How do you deal with the evil in the world? How do you deal with the evil in yourself? And the Christians argue, of course, that we're all sinners, and most of us, as Mencius points out, we are born with the luminous virtue, but through the senses that tends to become obscured. And it's the search for the lost mind, which Mencius refers to, is to get your inborn luminous virtue unobscured so that it becomes pure and you get to this higher point. But I think it's worth reflecting on this question of evil in the world. You've all heard, I'm sure, that Leibniz talked about this being the best of all possible worlds. And what did he mean by that? Do you have water?
I'll get you some.
Okay. And what he was ridiculed. You probably know that Candide by Voltaire was an attack on Leibniz precisely on this issue, where he writes a story about somebody who's just destroyed by natural disasters, by evil people, by this and that. And this shows that it's just absurd to think that this is the best of all possible worlds. Well, what they're really arguing is that you can't change the world. The world is fixed. Evil cannot be defeated, that you can't do anything to better society. Whereas Leibniz clearly meant that even natural disasters teach us something, in the sense that because we have the creative power of reason, because we have this gift of creativity given to us at our birth by God, we therefore can observe what causes natural disasters, and we can come up with ways of absolving them. And the same thing with evil in people. We learn from things that go wrong to create a better and more perfected world. So I think here again, in Christianity, you have the idea of confession and atonement, or the expiation of sins. And Confucianism has exactly the same concept, and Mencius again talks about cleansing the obscured mind, right? Expiating the sin of having allowed your mind to become obscured by lower ordered things, sensual things. So I think that's all I need to say about the homework questions. There are other questions that were sent in which I'd like to address, but
Why don't we intersperse them?
do you have some?
Oh yeah.
Has something come in?
Well, yeah. So why don't we go and start taking questions now? And if we want to intersperse some of the email ones, we can do that. So we'll go to Seattle in just a sec. I will also tell people who are listening online, you can email your questions to classes@larouchepac.com. And we'd especially like you to call into the conference line system and ask your question yourself. And the number and instructions for doing that are on the class webpage. If you're in the conference system and you'd like to get into the question and answer queue, you should dial *6. And when we see you in there, we will put you in line to ask your question. So why don't we go to Seattle and see if there's anything there first?
Okay, hi Mike.
Hi.
You okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So so I have a couple questions, but the your opening statement on the homework and whatnot already kind of was useful. So I'm going to skip to something else that I've been thinking about and wanted to ask about. We've been reading here the Lynn's Earth's Next 50 Years book, and in it he alludes to, I mean, in the I should say the one that I've been looking at is the Becoming Eurasian World essay, which is this wonderful dialogue of or discussion about a dialogue of cultures and civilizations, and really what the way he poses it is what is necessary to combine the Western and Eastern cultures essentially in the coming years. And this might have been something you already answered, but I want to ask it anyways and see if you have any more thoughts on it, because what he references is that there is a kind of I think he says it's an endemic caste-like phenomenon that exists with the Asian cultures, which I think might be something you were talking about with what happened after the Christians were kicked out in the 1600s, and then you've had several centuries of isolation and other complex problems. So anyways, that was what I wanted to ask about, because obviously, and you said this in your article, that through the Confucian history and the thinking that you've discussed, it's very evident that there's a principle of individual kind of creative sovereignty as the basis for an actual sovereign republic-esque nation state. But anyways, despite that, Mr. LaRouche comments that you still have these kind of lasting plagues in Asia that have to be resolved at a certain point. So I think Xi Jinping is doing a tremendous job, but maybe there's more you could say about that.
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a very, very complex question, isn't it? It's certainly the case. If you just look at China, what I said before and what you referred to is true. You know, when the connection was broken with the West, and then the British came in and destroyed the country over the next 100-some years. The Sun Yat-sen's revolution in 1911 never really got consolidated. And I won't go through the history of it, but he was actually, I mean, the people that were around him who took the country, it was very quickly crushed by a warlord who was being backed by the British and whose Sun had to compromise with. And he then spent the rest of his life developing the idea, the industrial development of China. You've probably all seen this 1919 report he did on how you could build railroads all over the country and canals, which is being done today by Xi Jinping. But that never got implemented at that time. He worked with Chiang Kai-shek, and they were able to defeat the warlords and unify the country. But they were still under massive control from London. And the revolution in 1949, the Communist Revolution, and I should point out that Zhou Enlai, that I pointed out to you, who was the most important person in the Maoist circle, remained close to Chiang Kai-shek throughout, even when they were at fierce battle with each other. They remained close because these were the two key thinkers in the two factions there. But in any case, you then had very bad experiences under Mao. You had the so-called Great Leap Forward, which was a self-defeating, almost insane policy, which led to vast starvation, and then they recovered from that, and on and on. So by the time Lin is writing this material in the 1990s, the kind of explosion that we now know took place with Deng Xiaoping's reforms and the transformation of China were nowhere to be seen. Helga actually pointed this out in her presentation in New York this afternoon. I hope you all watched it. I mean, she made the point that she went to China in 1971, and the place was just horrible. People were sad. There was the Red Guards were on the march. This was the height of the Cultural Revolution. And then when she returned in the 90s, just such a complete transformation. Not so much the economic development of the country. That hadn't really taken place at the level that we now see. But the transformation of the people who were tremendously optimistic, who had a sense of getting forward. But as I said last week, when you saw the 1989 Tiananmen Square crisis, Lin looked at this on TV, but he looked into their eyes and he said, these people are searching for their soul. And I think this is the kind of thing he was referring to when he did his prison writings, and earlier when he wrote The Next 50 Years that you're referring to. You're dealing here with an Asian culture which had been crushed by the same enemies we have here, and which were fighting to find their soul, as Lin, I think, correctly put it. And he emphasized that the Christian character of any global renaissance was extremely important in the character of what Cusa represents within the Christian tradition. And then let me say on the West side of this, the idea of the individual sovereignty that you referred to. This is obviously very, very important. I mean, the idea of the Trinity that we've discussed last week in all religions, if we accept Kuza's approach to this, which I think we must, the idea of the Trinity is that Christ represents, in the Christian tradition, Christ represents God in man, that he is God in the sense that all of them are triune. The God, the Father, is a triune nature. It enfolds all of the creation, and especially the creation of man in his own image. That Christ represents the fact that man is capable of participating in the unfolding creation, or in the love of God. Now, there's you probably know something about the filioque question in the Roman Catholic liturgy. You have the idea of the filioque, which is the Holy Spirit flows from God and from Christ, from the Father and from the Son, and from the Son is filioque in Latin. And this became the basis, or the core basis, of the break between the Roman Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition in Greece and Russia and so on, where it was argued that you cannot, that only God, that the Holy Spirit can only flow from God, not from the Son, not from man. And this was the issue that Kuza took on. And that thing that we discussed last week about his De Pace Fidei, this was also the basis on which Kuza intervened to bring about a coalition, or a concordance between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic tradition, which was really what made it possible to launch the Renaissance in Europe. And that didn't last forever, and there were all kinds of fights and so forth. But it was this fight over the filioque principle, where the argument was, if you deny the idea that man can act as Thomas A. Kempis says, in the imitation of Christ, or that Christ represents the fact that man is capable of reflecting the creative power, the love, the agape, the Holy Spirit, not in perfection, but in the triune nature of civilization and of the universe. So this became a fundamental issue. And politically, the argument was that if you reject the filioque, it politically means that you're accepting the idea that your leader is, in the sense that you see God as being totally separate from man, that politically you see the emperor as having somehow the divinity of the king, separated from his subjects. And that the necessity of having a political institutional structure which reflects the idea that the leader is serving the population rather than the population serving the leader, the idea of a republic. That all of these things were emerging during this time of the Renaissance, where these fights were being carried out. So the problem with the question of the individual sovereignty, it's extremely important, but also you can go the other way. What was the so-called Enlightenment? The Enlightenment took this to the extreme of saying that just as I pointed out last week, Sun Yat-sen criticized the radical factions of the May 4th movement by saying they have been so influenced by this modern so-called morality that they're throwing out morality. And this became true in the Enlightenment. I mean, for instance, Voltaire's attack on Leibniz took the form of saying you can't say there's any kind of universal good, and they argued a kind of existentialist, anything goes ideology. And unfortunately, Asians, as I think I also mentioned last week, our friend Patrick Ho, who, when he presented his view of the Silk Road and the philosophies behind the Silk Road, East and West, or the traditions historically East and West, he tended to take this Enlightenment view, which rejects religion, rejects the idea that there's a moral law to society, and to describe the West as being only an individualistic rejection of any kind of social responsibility, rejection of any kind of moral law, which of course is exactly what liberal society in the West tends to be. So, but many people in the West, or in the East, excuse me, tend to see, and this was also true in Malaysia. My big fight with Mahathir's enemy, Anwar Ibrahim, was because he wrote a whole book about how the West is, and then he described basically the Enlightenment, that they reject religion, reject morality, personal anarchy, not just personal sovereignty, but personal anarchy and moral anarchy. So things went much too far in the West because of the empire, because of the imperial ideology, because of the British Empire in particular, who advocated this kind of immoral so-called freedom, freedom to what? Take drugs, be a prostitute, and free trade, the freedom to sell drugs, to sell slaves. This was freedom. Well, this is anarchy. It's not freedom. And that is the same question that's addressed in terms of the individual sovereignty and the social responsibility, which were solved by the Renaissance, by Cusa, and were solved by the Confucian tradition in China, different ways with Chinese characteristics and Western characteristics, but it was solved. But that was crushed in China for a long, long time. Thank God the Chinese have not only revived it, but they're pushing it forward. And that's the only way you can have a renaissance. You don't just revive something from before. You have to be actually advancing those concepts which give you a guide to how to think about creating the future and then pushing that forward. And this is what we see today with this tremendous, true renaissance that's taking place in China, and the fact that Xi Jinping and the key people there are trying to bring that to be a universal renaissance, not a universal Chinese renaissance, but a win-win, new paradigm, community of shared future, as they say. So I think that answers the question.
Well, this question is, I think, right along those lines. Maybe it's just on a particular detail. This was sent in by Craig during the class last week, actually. But he asks, are we making any progress in getting our friends in the Chinese intelligentsia to understand the Republican versus oligarchic epistemological fight in the West, which is what you were just referring to? This seems so important. And given how hard it is to teach this to our supporters, much less to teach our supporters the history of this fight relevant to China today.
I saw that question, and I can't answer it completely. I have anecdotal evidence from some of the contact I've had with Chinese, but I think it's a problem. I think it's a continuing problem. I don't think they have any problem seeing the difference between oligarchical society and Republican society in China. I think there's a very much a sense that they have put behind the Oriental despotism that you had under many of the emperors. They recognize that the cult of Mao, which they don't totally blame on Mao, but the cult of Mao nearly destroyed the country, that it led into the Cultural Revolution. One of the things that happened in 1989 on the Tiananmen Square, one of the reasons that they did move quite forcefully to crush this, and it's exaggerated how many people died and things that you sometimes see from the West, but they put it down quite forcefully. And the reason was that they saw another cultural revolution rising up. And I think they were right, that had this proceeded with the leadership of some of the people like Zhao Ziyang, who were collaborating with Soros, who were peddling Western ideas from the liberal British variety. They were peddling Zhao Ziyang, who was sort of the leader. He was the heir apparent to Deng Xiaoping at the time. And he had brought into China textbooks for their universities, which included Milton Friedman, the Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. A lot of the British ideological crap was being brought in and taught as, here's how we escape from the communist era. Here's how we escape from the Maoist cult of the individual era and bring Western society. And this is exactly what Bertrand Russell was trying to do. And it was happening, and it led to this uprising which they had not yet found their soul. And so they put it down quite forcefully. But then they moved very, very rapidly to further deregulate and to further lift restrictions on the kind of development process that took place. I think Lin probably had an impact, even though we were very distant. I suspect that, like what happened in Russia when the Soviet Union fell and we discovered that the Russians had been studying Lin for a long time, the key scientists and key economists, I suspect that Lin's influence was greater than you can document in terms of the power of ideas which circulate. We were very much in touch with some of the people around that era and the Tiananmen Square crowd who all came over to the United States. And when I met with them, along with Laney and a few others, we very quickly realized that these people were really brainwashed by the Milton Friedman free market, free trade ideology. So we didn't pursue supporting them against the Beijing government, and we fairly quickly changed our view of what was taking place in China. So I think that is, I think we have a very, very big job here at home to teach this. We've never had a moment so opportune, as Helga really made clear this afternoon, because of the fact that after 50 years of attacking the British Empire and the idea of empire, Americans and people all over the world are now being exposed to the reality that Lin was right. It's the British Empire. They're the evil force. They're the ones who are running an operation to bring down the President of the United States, to start a war with Russia, to start a war with China, and they're exposed. So in this sense, we have a wide open situation to convey that difference between oligarchy and republican principles throughout the world, with the Silk Road idea hand in hand with the exposure of the empire. So I think this is going on simultaneously now, rather than one way there and one way here. This is a global fight where that issue is going to be resolved on a global basis.
Okay, well, why don't we go back to Seattle and see if they have another question there. And while they're getting that ready, I'll just remind people watching online, you can email your questions in to classes@larouchepac.com. You can call into the conference line and ask your question yourself. If you're in the conference line, dial *6 to get into the Q&A queue. So why don't we go and see if there's another question in Seattle?
Why don't we pass until the next round?
Okay, fine.
Yeah, let me take one that I have from my notes. Yeah. I'll do two. Let me just mention briefly that a couple of people in Seattle or in Vancouver sent in questions about Hinduism. And I wrote back to them and told them, I can't answer this, but this is a very, very interesting question. Can we extend this Trinitarian notion that we discussed in De Pace Fide under Cusa to the Hindu belief, to the Vishnu, Shiva, the Vedic culture? Lin has written a lot about Vedic culture. I personally haven't followed that very closely, but I think it's something that maybe some of you can pursue in light of the De Pace Fide. You can use Cusa, you can use some of the writing I did in terms of how it applied to China and Confucianism, but I think it would be very valuable to look into that. I can't answer it, but I wanted to bring it up here because I think this is a very important question. Both Mike and Stu in Vancouver asked basically the same thing. And now let me address a question that came in from Oswaldo Kaneki. And I want to take this because this addresses the sort of the theology issue. And I think we should try to keep this focused as much as possible on these philosophic and theological issues. I won't try to reproduce exactly what he said. I'm not sure I completely understand what he said. But the idea was that all religions are transcendent. They all believe in a higher power, in a belief in God. Some, he referenced St. Thomas Aquinas, use science, promote scientific development, but never over God. And that some people, I don't know if he does, but he said that pantheism, that some people consider it pantheistic to put science and mankind over God. So I bring that up because I think these are the profound questions, and I think what we just ended up discussing already about the filioque also addresses that issue. If are you putting man over God by talking about Christ being a source of the Holy Spirit, or by believing that man participates in the unfolding creation? It doesn't necessarily put man over God. Anybody who does that is essentially rejecting the idea that there's a single wisdom, a single unity, a single truth in the universe. But if you don't somehow come to an understanding that what makes man different is not just that he has a more powerful mind, but that he's able to see the future. Did you hear Helga this afternoon? Helga's example of the difference between human beings and animals was that if you tell a dog, let's take a walk, it'll wag its tail and and get ready to go. But if you say, let's take a walk tomorrow, he'll act the same way because he has no sense of tomorrow. He knows the word walk, but he doesn't know the word tomorrow, and he can't even conceive of the word tomorrow. So, but this idea that the creative power of the mind to participate in the unfolding creation, if you don't understand that, you don't have a sense of what makes man man. And if you think that the creation is fixed, that God made the world and it's the same, and this is the true of many of the oligarchy ideologies, is that the world is fixed. The whole green ideology, the whole idea that we're running out of resources, that's a total misconception of the nature of the universe. It believes that there's only so many resources available and only so much space for human beings, and we're overpopulating and we're using up our resources. This is it's an absurd concept, which doesn't understand even the notion of what a resource is, because when we discover new technologies, as you all know, you redefine what your resource base is. So these notions of transcendence cannot be allowed to refute this fundamental character of man, that he was born in the image of God precisely, if you're a Christian, you think of it that way, precisely because you are able to foresee the future and to shape the future. You are participating in the unfolding creation of the universe in a way which makes you like unto God. It doesn't make you God. It doesn't make you above God, whatever your conception of God is. But you have to understand this Trinitarian idea if, in fact, we're going to have a piece of the faiths. The Muslims call it being a vicegerent of God. The Confucians have this idea of having the principle that's coherent, sort of the mandate of heaven, not just for the ruler, but for all people. You have a mandate of heaven, this concept. So these things, anyway, that's I think the answer to that question, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, why don't we check in?
Do you have others or no?
Yeah.
Anything that's come in now? Or just from last week? I have the ones from last week.
Yep, we have one, which asks, this is from Lawrence. He asks, how well will the individual prosper in the new paradigm with China? Were the individual to be as great and on equal platform as the entire, or as an entire kingdom's king or queen?
How will the individual prosper in the new paradigm with China? Well, What I just said, I think, is the way to answer that. That the mandate of heaven, what Zhu Xi did in advancing the ideas of Mencius and Confucius, which we discussed last week, how he sort of rewrote the Daxue, the Great Learning, is that he extended what may have been considered or accepted to only mean what the king or the rulers should be to all the people. The idea that the mandate of heaven not only will be removed from a ruler if there is want and distress in the kingdom, but that this applies to every single human being, is that you have a mandate of heaven. The Christians call this being born in the image of God, and that the individual responsibility is both to develop that creative power, to act upon the mandate of heaven, which in the human being is that creative potential, the inborn luminous virtue, not letting it get obscured, or if it's been obscured, to seek it out, as Mencius said. And in that sense, the individual becomes a shaper of the universe as a whole. What Kuza talked about is the minimum and the maximum, or the coincidence of opposites. The idea that even something as inconsequential in the universe as a whole, as a single individual, because of this character of the creative power of the human mind, it has the potential of actually affecting the universe as a whole through discovering new ideas or mastering ideas that were discovered by others in a way that you can apply them to changing the platform of production or changing the nature of our culture through great music or great art. Each of these things represents the capacity of the individual to change the universe, not to be great because, like it's a sporting event or something where you hit the ball farther than anybody else in history, but rather that you have a moral responsibility because what motivates your creativity, what actually gives you happiness in the Leibnizian sense, rather than the excitement and joy of some sort of sensual thing, what gives you that kind of joy is your ability to actually do something which is going to be eternal. What does it mean for man to have eternal life? Does it mean, your soul is dressed in a nice suit and you're sitting up in heaven someplace? Or does it mean that your contribution to mankind is going to be eternal? It's going to continue being used long after you've gone. That if we look at the world today from 50 years from now or 100 years from now, we obviously aren't going to be, not us old people, aren't going to be around at that time. But we will be around at that time, just like Leibniz is still around in the fact that he inspires minds to do things that change the world. And that other great figures in history, and Lyndon LaRouche, will be unquestionably eternal in that sense. And he knows that. He knows that his eternity comes from his never, ever, even in the silence of in the private of his room, he never stops committing his mind to doing things that will, in fact, shape all of history and all of mankind 1,000 years from now. So where will the individual be? Well, if we master this relationship between the one and the many, between the minimum and the maximum, through this process, through what I think one of the most beautiful expressions of that is this Kuza idea of the Unitarian nature of the universe, Trinitarian, excuse me, that this is the basis upon which we can aspire to have a world in which, in fact, everybody has the potential and can act on that potential to contribute to the future of humanity as a whole.
So this came in from Sydney. I'm going to see if I can read it clearly. Sydney asks, what is it with the saying from Confucius, renewing what is old? And then they ask, is that the same as renewing the principles on a new garment? Or is there an idea to perfect the knowledge being able to introduce new, higher forms of power. And then there's a second question. Why don't you answer that first?
I think you answered your own question. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. It's clearly not. It's like what we said a few minutes ago about a renaissance. A renaissance is not just renewing the old. It's pulling the old that has been discarded by bad cultures, pulling it back and acting on it, because what you're pulling back is not just a set bunch of rules or laws or something. You're actually pulling back that inspiration for creative development that allows you to move ahead of what you're renewing, so that the Renaissance itself is creating a future rather than just restoring the past. So I think you've answered your question. The second part is?
Henry Kissinger wrought years of renewal, which said the picture, how effective is this today in the minds of people?
I don't know what you're getting at. I don't understand the question.
Cindy, maybe if you want to email in again or even call in and clarify, we can.
It probably is worth mentioning something about Henry Kissinger, because, as you know, Kissinger opened up China. He, basically worked with Zhou Enlai to bring about the Kissinger trip to Beijing, taking Nixon to China. And subsequently has been a strong supporter of collaboration with China and has done some things that are not that bad. But all of that was done based on geopolitics. He actually is even better on Russia today than he was in other times. And despite all the evil he did during his reign of terror, I would say, in being the key person unleashing many of the horrors that we saw in Indochina during the Nixon era, and similar things here. But nonetheless, they were thinking in terms of playing the China card. Brzezinski was involved in this. Brzezinski was actually worse than Kissinger on this. In fact, Brzezinski used to say to the Chinese, he said, you think this was, remember, there was a Sino-Soviet split during the, not sure I remember exactly the years, but early on in the Cultural Revolution, there was a split, a very serious split. The Russians pulled back a lot of their science, a lot of their technology. There were some border conflicts. It was a serious fight. But Brzezinski used to tell the Chinese, you think you hate the Russians? I hate the Russians more than you hate the Russians. Real Polish aristocrat. But Kissinger was also playing the China card. Part of why they opened up to China was because they decided that because of the Sino-Soviet split, they would buddy up with China and somehow get China to work with them against Russia. So it had geopolitical intentions, but nonetheless, it was something that was extremely valuable. The Chinese understood it. They began sort of acting on a win-win approach, where they said, we'll work with the United States and open up. So Kissinger also is somewhat of a complex figure, despite some of the very gross evil that he committed during some of his time. You want me to take one from before? Okay, another question from last week came in from Daniel Richards. He said that he's often confronting people who think that how can you possibly support China for all the evil that they're doing in Tibet and in Taiwan and so forth. And this of course, is true. I answered him in writing, but I think it's extremely important to understand the Tibet question, especially the Taiwan question. I think people understand. The one China idea is that eventually there will be reunification, but there's no hurry. It's just that we're not going to fight. We're not going to have a war between the two of us. And the basis on which the U.S. was able to then recognize China rather than this totally idiotic idea that we represented, we considered Taiwan to be the representative of China after the Communist Revolution, because Chiang Kai-shek was in Taiwan. But that just made no sense. We were just not recognizing, a fifth of the world's population centered in Beijing's capital. So that, I think, is a big issue, but I don't think we have to discuss it here. But the Tibet issue is a moral question, a fundamental moral question. The idea that the Dalai Lama is a great moral teacher to the world is an abomination. The Tibet, which had been greatly influenced by the British, by the Nazis, actually during the Nazi era, they loved this, as the Nazis looked to them as sort of the source of the pure race. And there's a long story to that. But the culture they had, this was Tantric Buddhism. This was the most degenerate form of Buddhism. Let me step back. Did I say anything about Buddhism last week? I don't think I did. Let me just say a few words about Buddhism. It's not exactly a monotheistic religion, but I think the only way to look at Buddhism is the way Leibniz did, which is that you look to see where Buddhism as a religion has facilitated a successful culture. And if you look, there's three main sort of tracks of Buddhism, as I understand it. The so-called Mahayana Buddhism, which was northern India, the Great Wheel, they call it. And then there's the Hinayana or Theravada Buddhism, which was in the south, it's that Theravada Buddhism which moved into Sri Lanka, into Southeast Asia, and which is the form of Buddhism in Thailand and Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. The Mahayana Buddhism moved into China. Most of what you have in China and Japan in terms of Buddhism comes out of the Mahayana, and it sort of the Zen Buddhists came out of that. The Mahayana and especially the Zen tended to reject classical studies. The Theravada was based on the profound books of the founding of Buddhism, and I'm not an expert on this. I don't mean to sound like I'm trying to be an expert, but the idea was only through extensive study could you reach nirvana. The Mahayana tended to be that in the Zen form especially, there would be sort of, the teacher would hit you over the head and you'd be enlightened and you'd reach nirvana, or something somewhat less crazy than that, but not much. But the Mahayana form of Buddhism never nurtured a successful society. You have, what happened is it became a very predominant religion in China and in Japan, but it was always coexisting with Confucianism and with Taoism. In fact, it was sort of Taoism and Buddhism coming together that led to Zen and the more crazier forms of this stuff. But they were never the dominant religion. There were periods where Buddhism was more dominant in China, but by and large, it was always this Confucian tradition that pushed things forward. And periods of stagnation, there tended to be more Buddhist. But the Theravada Buddhists became the cultures in Southeast Asia, and these cultures have prospered and grown and developed, and they're still there today in Southeast Asia, with ups and downs and so forth. But the third form of Buddhism was this Tantric Buddhism, which came out by its interface with some of the Mongols during the period of the Mongol hordes, and ended up being in Tibet. And this is a really sick, degenerate culture. Their belief is that the sexual act is the pinnacle of the religious phenomena. It's totally sensual in nature. It talks about transcendence and so forth, but by and large, this was a culture where the average lifespan was, I think, 27 or something like that. That the Buddhist monks, there were, I forget the exact number. Paul Gallagher and I did an article on this, which you can look up, and I encourage you to read it. But the very high percentage of the population became monks and didn't work. The peasants were extremely poor and oppressed. The sexual cults were disgusting. Most young people, young boys and girls, had to become basically sexual slaves to the monkhood. So when the Chinese finally moved in and reasserted Beijing control over Tibet. This was indeed a liberation of Tibet. And what's happened in Tibet since that time is there's problems. There's a lot of problems because there were a lot of Han Chinese who came in, and at periods they might have had more of the jobs, and so there was tensions. But the Tibetan people have gone from being extremely oppressed to being a modern culture. They now have a railroad that can get them out of Tibet. Their lifespan is I don't know exactly, but it's human. It's like the rest of China, I'm sure. There's development. People are becoming scientists. They're getting educated. It's now a real society again, and the Tibetan people, by and large, are extremely grateful. And the idea that they're all ready to revolt and join the Dalai Lama is just an absurdity. So when you hear this kind of stuff from people about, oh, China's oppressing the Tibetan people, I mean, this is purely based on the lies that are spread by the British Empire, who think that what the Tibetan people need is to be able to live according to their original culture, when it was exactly what I've just described. Sort of like the Bertrand Russell stuff, the noble peasant. They would be happy if we don't disturb them with science and technology and let them be happy in their misery. So I think that's the way to answer that question.
We got an email in from Oswaldo who asks a different question. He asks, I remember somebody explaining about Zhou Enlai having an exposure to the American system during a trip to Hawaii. Is that true?
Zhou Enlai? I don't know. I'm sure Zhou Enlai traveled internationally. He was a diplomat. He traveled all over the world. So, I mean, he traveled to the United States. He traveled to Europe.
Perhaps it means Sun Yat-sen? Thinking of Sun Yat-sen?
Oh, yes. You're probably thinking of the story of Sun Yat-sen, who was educated in Hawaii. Let me say a word about, I think you probably mean Sun Yat-sen. And again, by the way, let me mention now, I'm going to send out to everybody through this class series. I'm hoping that through the class last week and perhaps the discussion tonight, some few or many of you might decide that you also want to take on China as fulfilling Helga's call on everybody to take at least one culture, one nation, and to study it deeply. So I'm going to send out a sort of a reading list, not just a few things to read for a class, but extensive writings of my writings and a few of my associates' writings, which also will include giving you direction towards other kinds of things that you can read. But if you want to start with some of what I've written about all of these different issues, it's not a bad way to start, but it'll also send you to some other books about China, but also some of the other original Chinese writings by people like Zhu Xi, which I encourage you to do. And there's several articles on Sun Yat-sen, not just by me, but by others in the organization. And it's absolutely the case that when he was a young man, his brother had gone to Hawaii to work, and he went and was taken in by a family. I'm forgetting the name of the family right now, but a family that had come from the Philadelphia school, that had worked in the Lincoln circles, in the Henry Carey circles in particular, and was taught Christianity. He became a Christian. He's an example of someone who was both a Christian and a Confucian all his life, or at least from that point forward. But also studied the American history and the American system in depth. I think I definitely mentioned last week that his 3 principles of the people came directly from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But he also was able to write, and he did in his speeches and in his books, about the nature of the American system, the importance of Alexander Hamilton, and he was able to draw a distinction between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. He knew these were the 2 main tendencies within the American Revolution, and he knew that it was Hamilton, who understood the necessity of directing credit into the infrastructure, the education, and so forth of the population, whereas Jefferson was arguing for a slave society and keeping the country agricultural. That the so-called advantage of America was their agriculture, so we should let the British do the manufacturing and we do the agriculture, which was just a defense of this hideous slaveocracy. And he writes about this at some length. His criticisms of Marx are based on his understanding of Hamilton. And he learned this directly from people who were part of the missionary circles in Hawaii who actually were part of the American system school. So I think that's what you're referring to, and it's absolutely true. This is something that I think, gives you a sense of that it's not accidental. And when I said before that I think Lin's influence in China was probably more than we know, the power of ideas. Here's Sun Yat-sen bringing American system ideas into China. He got crushed. There were warlords. It never got implemented. He developed his industrial development of China ideas, but those ideas were introduced there. American system ideas, and both the Chiang Kai-shek and the Mao Zedong schools praise Sun Yat-sen and claim him for theirs. There's divisions in the family, the wives and so forth. There's two sisters, the Sung sisters, were married to Chiang Kai-shek and to Sun Yat-sen. So one of them sort of went with the Chiang Kai-shek school, and the other went to Beijing and became. In fact, Helga was honored by the school of Sung Jingling, who was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, who went to Beijing and became very much a part of the development of China during the communist era. So these ideas of the American system persisted, and in a period where people become optimistic again and have a future and have a sense of a mission, they reach back for these ideas. And this is what it means when Helga and Lin say that, at this point in history, the Chinese are leading the American system. They don't call it that, but we have relegated the American system to the dustbin of history, unfortunately, and especially since the death of Roosevelt and then the killing of Kennedy, we've essentially became a satrapy of the British Empire using British free market, free trade policies, which have led to the ruin that we're seeing right now of the American economy and the American culture and the American foreign policy. But the Chinese are following what was better known as the American system and are doing it quite well and are offering America to rejoin the American system and joining the new Silk Road.
So I have some more. Do you want to take some of these? Or
Okay.
Okay. So this was emailed in by Fode. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who asks, although each religion or culture that is successful must be governed by a principle which is universal, the principle is emphasized to a greater or lesser extent. How then, given your example of Confucius and Buddhism, can we inspire cultural renaissances and steer it such that it tends toward the good under the influence of popular opinion and culture? I guess they mean today.
Yeah.
Given our tendency to sneak in undermining or evil ideas. I say this because most Humeans have a tendency to incorporate you into their philosophy rather than refute you. As long as we reject the idea of a universal principle, it seems that they can neutralize you by dilution.
Right. No, I agree. I think what you're saying is right. And I think it's the case that there will not be another European Renaissance or another Chinese Renaissance or an African Renaissance. I think the era in which there can be a renaissance of a culture which is isolated enough from the rest of the world that it can have such a renaissance is gone. So in that sense, the basis on which you, well, I won't, the only basis on which you're going to have people turning to this what the Confucians know as the principle, or absolute, the absolute, is going to be on a universal basis. And I think the Chinese know that. I think the Chinese know that they're doing everything in their power, as Xi Jinping laid out at the 19th Party Congress, where he set 2035 is going to be when we reach a level of a moderately advanced society. By 2050, we're going to be a modern industrial power in the world. He has that vision. But I think he knows that this is not going to work unless there is a universal approach, that what he's doing with the Silk Road is, on the one hand, trying to bring the kind of development that they proved is possible in China to the rest of the developing sector nations. But in his very clear appeal to Europe and the United States, he recognizes that in the long run, it's not going to work. If they're isolated, if for instance, the current very tense atmosphere about the tariffs and trade war, whether there's going to be trade war, if this thing ends up being a conflict, that they're going to fight to the end. They're not going to give up. They're going to defend their rights as a nation and so forth. But they recognize that is what's necessary for them as well as for the rest of the world is that we come to a new paradigm in which the human beings recognize that we are all human beings and that we have to get over the divisions that are artificially imposed upon us by oligarchs who want to keep the world divided. And in that way, what we're doing through this recognizing the complete coherence, as, for instance, we've been discussing today, the complete coherence between ethical and scientific issues, between the moral responsibilities in society as well as in science, that you have moral responsibilities in science, that these are issues that are universal and that we have to create this kind of a renaissance as a universal renaissance, or it's going to end up undermining anybody, including the Chinese, ability to sustain what they've set in motion. This is a huge responsibility. It's not just that we are finally at a time in history where we can actually end the notion of empire, but we have to. It's necessity. It's this question of freedom and necessity again. We have a moment of opportunity in which the human race can actually truly be brought together on the kind of foundation that, for instance, Nicholas of Cusa addressed, and that the Chinese, in their own way, through the Confucian tradition, addressed. But if we don't succeed in that, if we end up having a war, you can imagine in this day and age what a global war would be like. I mean, a thermonuclear age war could be the termination of civilization, period, at least as we know it. And these are very serious issues. And as many people at the conference going on in Russia right now, the 7th International Strategic Conference, a number of leading Russian and other people in the strategic area, defense ministers and people who are involved in strategic issues, have said, we're in a greater danger of war now than any time during the Cold War, even more than the Cuban Missile Crisis. The situation is such, and the way we look at it, which I think is important for people around the world to see, and for once it's possible for them to see, is that this is precisely what the British Empire wants, because the empire is dying. And the empire, if you think of the empire as not just individuals, but institutions, an institutional structure, that the empire will risk going to war if they think the empire is going to be destroyed. And in fact, they would prefer a war, even a thermonuclear war, which they think they could probably win, than seeing the empire die. So this is what we're looking at. The British are at this point absolutely hysterical. They're terrified because they've been forced to come out in their own name on this whole Skripal story and so forth. This mythical attempted assassination by what they blame on the Russians. It's so artificial, so foolish, so ridiculous that it's now, and they were not able to call upon the U.S. to back them up. In the past, when Tony Blair launched the war in Iraq, which unleashed this hell that swept through the Middle East, that drove millions of people out of their homes and so forth, he was able to call on George Bush to take the lead because the Americans had become this subservient, dumb giant to the British Empire. Same thing with Obama in the Libya war and the attempt to do the same thing in Syria. But it's just not working this time because Trump is not going along with this. He's insisting, even though he allowed his neocon crowd to throw 60 diplomats out, he himself hasn't said a word about it. And he insisted, he called Putin immediately after the story. He has said twice that, yes, we're still committed to being friends with Russia. It's a good thing to be a friend with Russia, not a bad thing. And he still wants to meet with Putin. So this has got the British terrified, and they're going to do anything they possibly can. Ukraine is a good example. They, to a certain extent, the Russians have neutralized the Middle East crisis. And Trump personally, along with Russia and China, has neutralized the North Korean crisis. And they're moving towards this meeting. The Ukraine situation is still unfortunately, under largely the British and neocon crowd here control. And I think, for instance, when Trump called Putin after the Skripal poisoning, one of the things they admitted they talked about was Ukraine, along with Syria and Korea and so forth. So they're working on it. But this thing is potentially getting out of control. It could start a war. And if you have a war with Russia, you can forget all the things we've been talking about in terms of creating a future. The future would be determined for us, and it would be a dark age. So this is a time where we can and we must create this global renaissance. There's no option. There's no alternative.
Well, maybe then I'll pose the question that came in last week from Mike, I think it was, who asked about Korea. He said, how does Korean civilization compare to Chinese civilization? Now that Kim Jong-un has had this historical visit to Beijing, what are the future prospects of these countries?
Yeah, I answered him in writing, but I have no idea what Kim Jong-un thinks. I do know, just from reading other people who do know him, and many Korean scholars and experts have had the opportunity to interact with Kim Jong-un, Americans too. And they all say, this idea that he's a madman and so forth is nonsense. He's very smart. He knows what he's doing. What he does is not always perhaps the wisest thing, but that he's not some dummy. So what I do know about Korea, though, and not in depth, I haven't really looked into this in great depth, but I've talked with a number of Koreans about it, is that you remember last week I talked about Juche, and then I briefly mentioned that about 150 years later there was a guy named Wang Yangming who was the one who said, I'm going to test Juche's idea about the principle in things by sitting down in front of the bamboo, and after a couple of days and he finally fell asleep, and he decided there's no such thing as principle because I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it or touch it or feel it or eat it. It didn't tell me what its principle was. So that became a major school of thought, and it's very much Aristotelian. It's very much empiricist. They believe in science as an empirical study. They reject the idea that you have to look into the principle of things to truly make any kind of scientific discovery. At that time, this became known as the Neo-Confucian school, Juche and Wang Yangming. They're actually complete opposites. It's sort of like saying that Plato and Aristotle represent Greek philosophy. Well, they're as opposite as they can be. So to link them as somehow a common thing is just wrong. And the same thing is true about so-called Neo-Confucianism. Now, I mention that because at the time, Wang Yangming became extremely influential, negatively, in China, in my view. And the Koreans, who had already been very much part of the Jushi school. As I mentioned before, Jushi had established the 4 books. He'd established the basic curriculum for schools, for universities, for the exams, and that became very standard throughout China and Korea, and I believe parts of Japan too. I'm not 100% sure about that, but in Korea for sure, this was they had become very much part of this resurgence of Confucian thinking along the lines of Jushi and the Sung Renaissance. And when Wang Yangming came along, the Koreans quite openly rejected Wang Yangming's teaching. It became very predominant in China, and it became a constant fight between these 2 tendencies. But the Koreans rejected it absolutely and stuck with the Jushi teaching. I think that if we studied that, we would find that that's one of the reasons that the Koreans were very, very open to Christianity. And there's a very, very large Christian tradition and a large Christian population, both Catholics and Protestants, in Korea. Kathy Wolf, who worked with our organization for a long time and who spent a lot of time in Korea, wrote about how the classical culture, classical art songs, for instance, from Europe, came in through the church and were accepted by the Buddhist and Confucian cultures and society. There was less conflict between Christianity and the other schools. So I think this gave a certain, you might call it modern cultural aspect to the Koreans, which still exists today. How that works in North Korea is a very, very interesting question. I'm not sure if the North Korean Communist government had anything like the really vicious anti-Christian, anti-religious ideology that showed up sometimes in China. It's a question that would be worth pursuing.
Okay, well, Miles asks, how closely is the current of Leibnizian thought equated with Confucianism in China and in Asia in general?
Say it again.
How closely is the current of is the closeness of Leibnizian thought with Confucianism understood in China or in Asia in general?
Well, I'm not sure I know for sure. In general, when I've talked to Chinese scholars about all of this, if I can say the word Leibniz in its Chinese character well enough, they know who I'm talking about. So they do have some of this knowledge. Kepler, on the other hand, is much more well known. There's a whole tradition of Kepler, which I'll say a few words about this. It's very interesting, and this is one of the articles I wrote. It was in the 21st Century magazine that we used to publish on the Keplerian culture in China. As I mentioned, the Jesuits were the leading. They took over the astronomical schools and so forth. When the second major group of Jesuits were on their way to China, and these tended to be a group from France, actually the same Paris University where Leibniz was, this second group of German and French Jesuits, they wanted to take the most modern scientific knowledge with them, the way Matteo Ricci had. When Ricci went there, he went with Renaissance science. He taught science. He built classical musical instruments. He taught them modern art, European forms of art, Renaissance art. And there was a great Italian painter, his name I forget right now, but who actually mastered the Chinese form of painting. So his paintings are very much a beautiful mix of sort of Renaissance art and Chinese art. But anyway, they wanted to take the very best of Western science, and their first impulse, the most famous scientist at the time, was Galileo. So they wrote to Galileo, and they said, please send us all of your work and writings that we can package and take with us to China. And they got no response. So they went to what they considered the second best, and they went to Kepler, and Kepler was ecstatic. I mean, he was extremely happy to do so and provided them with extensive material on all of his work on his astronomical work and his philosophical writings. I don't know exactly which books. I couldn't find out which of his writings were actually in the portfolio that the Jesuits took with them to China. But if you go to Beijing today and you go to the observatory that was built in Beijing, it's about a 3-story stone building, not that large. And on top are the instruments that were built by the Jesuits and the Chinese astronomers, these astrolabes and all kinds of beautiful, beautiful instruments. You should look it up on Google or something and just look at these instruments sitting on top of this old astronomical building. And down in the basement, or in the first floor, there is a wall with pictures of the great Chinese philosophers and Kepler. He's there. The idea that Kepler's work and the Jesuits who brought his work are very much expressed, and the Jesuits who were part of that also have their pictures on the wall. But this is well, it's probably not as well known in China as it could be. I should probably make that proviso. Many people don't even know about the existence of that building. I found. But this tradition is certainly people who've studied this tradition, and this is being studied more and more as a result of the Renaissance that's taking place in Confucian thinking. So I think a lot of these ideas, we have a certain hand. We can contribute a great deal, I think, to this in terms of what we are making available to them in our study about the connections between the East and the West, which some people there know, but which we can help spread those ideas both there and here.
Okay, we have another one by email, but did you want to take one from last week? Is there another one you wanted to get to?
I'll mention one from a Joseph Yamraz, who said, "What should we do about China's theft of our technology and innovation?" I think you probably just got that from a news account. There's no question but that China was smart enough. I think I mentioned this last week, that Deng Xiaoping, when he finally came in after the Cultural Revolution was stopped, the first thing he did was send thousands and thousands of Chinese students all over the world to study science and technology primarily, and other things, but especially that. So that they were very hungry to master the ideas of the Western world. And in terms of copying technologies, they were very good at it. But the idea that there's something wrong with this is nuts. Scientific and technological discoveries are universal automatically, just by the nature of the human mind. Now, you may have patents, and there might be problems with their breaking patents that are holding in the West, so that people who make discoveries can at least recoup their investments and make some profit on it. But the idea that the technologies are owned by a certain nation is crazy. And I think the best proof of that is the negative proof of the stupidity of the United States in passing laws that said that NASA may not work with China because China is going to steal our great science and our great technology, supposedly, to punish the Chinese. So they passed a law in the Congress that NASA is not allowed to work with China. Now, there's ways to get around it. But now you have China taking the lead in space travel, going to the far side of the moon, developing new technologies, new concepts that are in many ways advanced on what's happening in the West. There's still other areas where the West is in the lead, but the idea that we can't work with them because they'll steal our technologies has now become exactly the opposite. And this is true. If you've had a chance to read I've written 3 or 4 articles in the last month or so about certain aspects of what China is doing in China. One is their massive water moving project, where they're moving water from the south, which is plentiful water in the north, which is horribly dry, and they are in desperate need of getting water into the north just to continue the development of the north. But they've developed these huge water moving projects in three different channels, one along the coast, one in the central area, moving water from the Yangtze River up until the Yellow River area and around Beijing. Technologies that we could have used or could have developed when we were promoting the Nawapa project to bring water down from Alaska into the 48 states, and which would have resolved the horrible crises we've had in the Southwest and in California since that time. But we just didn't do it. Kennedy wanted to do it, and it's one of the many things that went down with his assassination. But the Chinese did it. Of course, you all know about China's high-speed rail. They have, by far and away, the most advanced high-speed rail system in the world. They have about 2/3 of the high-speed rail in the world is within China. And they're building high-speed rail all over the world as well, in other countries, in Africa and South America and the rest of Southeast Asia. And in the process of that, they have developed technologies that machine tools, essentially, huge machine tools, to lay track, to develop the technologies needed to convey the electricity between the train and the electric currents, ways of developing high-speed, higher capacity metals for the wheels and things of this sort. And their bridge building, I did another article about this incredible bridge that Helga had the opportunity to see that goes from Macau to Zhuhai and Hong Kong. One of the most beautiful bridges ever built along basically open ocean, because it's at the mouth of the Pearl River, which is, where Hong Kong is, which is very, very wide and basically open ocean. And they built a bridge and a tunnel. They had to build a tunnel at one point. But the technology and the moral culture that went into these constructions are things that are beautiful to study and to see. And the CGTN and CCTV have some wonderful, wonderful documentaries on these things, which I encourage you to watch on YouTube. But these are technologies that we desperately need. And the Chinese now want to spread these technologies to the West. Do they have intellectual property right issues? Yeah, they do. There's certain things that can be worked out in a negotiated way. But what was the nature of the question? I'm sort of forgetting I got onto this. But I mean, this idea of technological sharing is the basis upon which we can bring this Silk Road collaboration into a much, much higher plane, especially getting China to invest in the U.S. And I'll mention, Helga mentioned this afternoon too, but this is something where Lin's 4 laws, one of them having this idea of a national investment bank, of a national bank or a national infrastructure bank. The Chinese have this $1 billion worth of U.S. government debt, which they would love to invest in American infrastructure. And if we built a national bank, they would be delighted to change their T-bills, their government debt, for equity in a national investment bank. And we would immediately have access to up to $1 trillion that could be then used as the collateral for generating credit into rebuilding the American economy, exactly what Trump wants to do. And it's our idea of going back to that Hamiltonian idea of a national bank or a national infrastructure bank, which the Chinese are chomping at the bit to be part of. They want to be part of it. We've talked to leading Chinese economists and others who are delighted by this idea that we can turn that debt into credit, the way Hamilton did, to bring their technologies to bear here in the United States. Oh, that was the question of the theft of technology. Yeah, right. So
we have another question which gets back to some of the history of Confucianism in China. Faramak asks, what was the status of Confucian philosophy under the Yuan-Mongol dynasty and afterwards the Ming and Qing dynasties?
Well, it's an interesting question because the Mongol invasion was a disaster. Zhu Xi died well, actually, he was in what's called the southern Sung because the Manchus had already moved into areas in the north, the Mongols rather. Um, no, I'm sorry, that was the Manchus. That was earlier. The Mongol invasions, which were in the 1300s, uh, were devastating. As you know, I'm sure they stole a lot of the gold from China. They were working with Venice and were actually trading with Venice and laid waste to much of Central Asia, much of Europe, and much of China. However, in China, and I haven't studied this deeply because in general it was a period of decay and collapse. But the Mongols very rapidly were assimilated into the Confucian culture. They brought with them their sort of pantheistic views of religions. The Mongols were part Christian. Genghis Khan was himself, his mother was a Christian, a Nestorian Christian, which is sort of a heresy. But they had Islam, they had Buddhism, they had various sects of different cultures, they had Taoists. It was very much a sort of pantheistic institutional structure. And they brought that with them. But the Confucian culture was so strong in China that in general, the emperors, the Mongol emperors, tended to adopt that culture. For instance, the art of the Confucian artists of that period tended to shape a lot of the culture under the Mongol reign in that time. And the Confucians were not crushed. They continued. There were fights. There were differences. And again, I'm not an expert on this. I'm giving you sort of little pieces I know. But what happened after finally the fall of the Mongols when the Ming Dynasty came in, which, if I'm not mistaken, was 16. Oh, no, wait a minute. That was the Ming. It was the 14 around 1400. The Mongols were finally overthrown by the Ming Dynasty, and this was the era of the great ships. I'm sure you've heard about Zheng He, the Muslim admiral who they built these huge treasure ships, by far and away bigger ships than anything you had in Asia at the time, late 1300s, early 1400s. And they traveled through Southeast Asia. They were establishing not colonies, but outposts sort of throughout Southeast Asia. They went to India. They went to Sri Lanka. They went to Africa. They went into the Persian Gulf. And there are reports that indicate they also went up to Egypt. Well, definitely they went up to Egypt, and they may well have gone from there into Italy, because we've recently learned that there are writings from that period that indicate that the Italians around Columbus were in touch with the Chinese. So all of this this was when China was by far and away the more advanced culture in the world. But what happened is that whole process got shut down, completely shut down. And according to the historical accounts, it was so-called Confucian scholars and Confucian government people who shut it down, who made the argument that this was that there were too many needs back at home for us to be spending so much money on these adventure ships and going out around the world. The same kind of argument you have against space travel and against any going forward today. Was it the Confucians? Well, it was certainly some school of the Confucians that did that, but it would indicate that there was a lot of degeneration and decay within coming out of the Mongol era, and as a result, this potential for the Ming to restore the Jushi tradition and go further ahead with the scientific renaissance that had happened under the Sung was crushed. And it happened just about the same time as the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe, which in a sense was the launching of the Renaissance in Europe. Just about the same time, the 1430s, the Chinese shut down the whole treasure ship thing and sort of turned inward. So there began a degeneration in China at the same time that Europe was taking off with the Renaissance. So this also then was the era under the Ming, was the era of this guy Wang Yangming that I said, who came in and ended up being very influential in the Confucian school. So I think that's a problem. There's a lot that can be studied there. I'm not the expert on a lot of this stuff by a long shot. So, but it's all fascinating questions. Why the Chinese turned in on themselves in the 1430s and shut down the treasure ships is a question in history which is studied by many people and has never been adequately answered.
Okay, I think we have one more question in Seattle, so we'll go there, and this will be our last question tonight.
Ah, it's almost 9:30.
Okay, this is Stuart again. Confucius, I know, talked about music and also talked about, I think, rites and traditions. And I think he is famously quoted saying, something like a good society has good music, and a not so good society, you can tell by the quality of the music of how a society is going, or something of that nature. But I figured that he's probably not thinking in a formalistic Aristotelian rites and formal tradition sense. So I wanted to ask what you might know about some of the things that he refers to in anything with music and kind of that side of culture.
Yeah, Helga brought this up in that wonderful speech she gave on Confucius and Schiller and stuff. Yeah, Confucius said that in an economy which is prospering and growing, the music expresses great joy, and in a declining economy, it's very somber and sad. And in a destroyed society, it's chaotic. And that's, look at what's happened in Europe over the last 150 years, Europe and America. It's certainly the case. So that's just sort of a recognition of the role of culture in society. I don't think he described it just as the result of the society. I think he probably recognized that the music actually contributed to whether an economy was growing and a culture was growing or destroying. There was a book of music amongst the great books at the time of which was lost. People tend to think it was lost during the time of Qin Shi Huang, that first emperor who burned the Confucian books. There's certain sections of it that are extant, but by and large that book was lost. But the most famous aspect of ancient Chinese music is this amazing fact about the bells, which it was determined, these bells where they performed the bells. The bells are beautifully designed. You have several notes on the bell. The bell is not just one note. You hit it in a different place, you get a different note. And there's some videos you can watch of that too, where people play pieces, melodies on a bell, on a series of bells. But it was discovered that these bells were tuned to the 256, which means that they had at least determined in a sense of a diatonic scale. They didn't have the diatonic scale the way it was developed later in Europe. But they did have a sense of the natural, what you might call natural tuning, that they had somehow seen, we don't know how, that the pitch should be set at a tuning which actually is coherent with physical nature. I'm sure maybe you've seen our friend Norbert Breinien, who was the head of the Amadeus Quartet, actually did experiments with his Stradivarius violin, where he turned it over on the back and put iron filings on it, and then played strings tuned to 256, and then tuned to the higher tuning that's common today, the A440 tuning. And the A440 tuning, am I lost? Am I still heard?
You can be heard.
Okay. The A440 tuning left the iron filings chaotic, and when you tuned it to 256, they would form beautiful harmonic patterns. Maybe this was the way that it was done by the ancient Chinese. Maybe they just found out through this kind of experiment because they already knew things about magnets and so forth. That very well could have taught them how to do that. So this is another area which is worthy of great study. I think you all know that today the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese are providing probably more classical musicians to Western orchestras than anyone else. And the Chinese children are massively educated in classical culture to a level that would make our schools, put them to shame. There's no question about that. So that the idea of classical music, piano playing, violin playing, and so forth is now very much part of every Chinese curriculum in every school, probably even in the poorest of the countrysides.
Okay, well, apologize for our video glitch. Maybe that's a sign that we should
Time to quit.
wrap things up. But I'll just say very quickly in conclusion, this was a wonderful, very valuable discussion these 2 weeks. Next week, we're back to our regular time, 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll have our 6th class in a class series taught by Jason Ross on science, man's relation to the universe. So everybody keep your eye on your emails. You'll be getting a follow-up email to this class. We'll send out the article or articles Mike was referencing, and we'll also send out the reading material to prepare for Jason's class next week. So thanks to everybody watching. Thanks to Seattle. Thanks to everybody on the conference line, and we will talk to you all soon.